In 1994, Pope John Paul II unveiled a newly restored Sistine Chapel to the world. This room, nestled at the heart of the Vatican, is the site where new popes are elected, surrounded by some of the most celebrated works of art in the world. Michelangelo's biblical frescoes look down from above, his densely packed Last Judgment looming over cardinals and tourists alike from the west wall. The other walls are decorated with paintings by some of the biggest names of the Renaissance: Perugino, Sandro Botticelli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Cosimo Rosselli. The room was painted in various stages, from the early 1480s to mid-1500s, and the images found in this holy space are immortalized in art history textbooks, postcards, novelty t-shirts, and virtual tours. These frescoes comprise some of the most recognizable and valued works in the art historical canon, and because of this, in addition to the sheer size of the room, the restoration was a gargantuan undertaking. The project of restoration employed some of the most skilled restorers in the business. Their tools only touched the surfaces of the Sistine Chapel after a long series of debates, studies, tests, and training. This effort drew the attention and concern of the entire world across many different fields. The entire undertaking spanned about 15 years. Work began in 1979 and involved numerous patch tests, slow and meticulous work, with those involved constantly recording every step of the process. When Pope John Paul II opened the doors to the Sistine Chapel once more, letting the public gaze upon these beloved works again, the restorers' painstaking, tireless efforts were finally visible to the public. Centuries' worth of soot and wax from the candles used to illuminate the rooms was removed. The grime and pollution permeating from countless clergy and tourists who regularly crowd the halls of the Vatican was reversed. The colors of the frescoes were revealed after centuries under a shadowy cloak, allowing viewers to witness them as Michelangelo himself had. Faced with these brilliant colors, newly revealed details, and considerably brighter room, reactions were mixed. Some gazed in awe at the sight. Others criticized the restorers, accusing them of having ruined the works, destroying Michelangelo's frescoes instead of saving them. This major restoration brought to the forefront a series of questions regarding the practice of restoration itself. What should be removed? What should be kept? What is history and what is an unwanted addition or modification? And who gets to decide? The Sistine Chapel has been restored many times in the past, perhaps most infamously by Daniele da Volterra. After reforms enacted by the Council of Trent, he was employed by Pope Pius IV in 1565 to cover the lewd genitalia that Michelangelo had painted in his Sistine frescoes, earning him the nickname Il Braghettone, roughly translated to the underwear maker. Strictly speaking, these additions aren't original, they weren't painted by Michelangelo, but they do form an important part of the history of the Catholic Church and the Sistine Chapel itself. Should restorers remove them? Should they be kept and only the grime removed? Should the work of all those whose hands added modifications or fixes to the frescoes over the course of 500 years be wiped out? These questions have no easy answer, and the debate in the world of art history and art conservation still rages. Some believe conservative conservation is the only way to go, preventing future damage by stabilizing the object but not cleaning it or performing any destructive practices, like removing a yellowed layer of varnish from a painting. Others believe it is crucial to reveal the work as the artist intended, by reversing the effects of time and removing any grime, non-original additions, patching tears, and so on. There are so many different techniques and schools of thought in the world of restoration and conservation that it would be impossible to cover them all in what I intend to be a short video, but I encourage you to read more about the theories in this field. It is very easy to feel passionate about these choices, and you should feel that way. Art moves us emotionally, provides a material form for our identity and history, and we rightfully grow very attached to these objects and monuments. But it is always important to remember that in the world of restoration and conservation, there is often no black or white correct answer that can be applied universally to all cases. We have to go on a case-by-case basis, and even then, two parties may disagree, while both presenting perfectly valid arguments. The point I'm trying to make is, remember to be kind to restorers and conservators, even if you don't personally agree with their chosen technique. In 2019, I was walking to one of my art history courses in the last year of my undergraduate degree. When I walked into the classroom, the professor had turned on the projector and was showing us a live feed of a shocking scene. The roof of Notre Dame in Paris was on fire. Blazes ripped through the 12th century wood beams, and we watched in horror as the intricate wooden spire collapsed. There we were, watching a church that we had all seen numerous times in our art history lectures, crumbling in front of us. Many of us recall watching the Notre Dame fire unfold on the news, an internationally renowned monument, a symbol of Paris and France, a major tourist destination, one of the most recognizable examples of the French Gothic style, and the setting and namesake of one of the best Disney films, in my subjective and also objectively correct opinion, was ablaze. Like with the Sistine Chapel, a major restoration effort was now underway, here with the added challenge of repairing the extensive damage suffered by the cathedral. Restorers would once more be under intense scrutiny from a global audience of supporters and detractors alike. Countless decisions would have to be made over the coming years regarding how to repair the cathedral, what to keep, what to replace, whether the damage of the fire should be preserved as part of the building's history. Once more, everyone involved in the restoration project would have to make decisions regarding issues that have no easy answers. In order to understand this restoration project better, I think we need to cover three different topics. One, the history of the cathedral itself and the Gothic style. Two, what restoration work was actually done. And three, the variety of reactions from experts and the public, and what these mean for how we conceive history, art, and the purpose of restoration and conservation. Let's start with the Gothic style. After seeing a lot of the reactions to the restoration recently unveiled, I'm starting to think that we don't really understand what the French Gothic style is, but that's okay, we can review it here. If you were to ask someone what they picture when they think of the Middle Ages and the Gothic period in art, you would probably hear something along the lines of gloomy, dark, sad, the Black Death. Now, a lot of this is due to the fact that the Middle Ages have often been considered as a lull in artistic and intellectual production between the much greater periods of classical Rome and the Renaissance. This idea of birth, death, and rebirth, hence the term Renaissance, is an unfortunately pervasive myth we inherit from the likes of Vasari and other 14th to 16th century thinkers, and all of their successors. We can still see this in movies and TV shows today, which seem to put a gray filter over all media set during the Middle Ages, removing all color and light. You probably know the Middle Ages by another name, the Dark Ages, but this term is woefully inaccurate. Some of the other reasons I think many of us associate the Gothic period and the Middle Ages more broadly with darkness, gloom, despair, with dust and cobwebs and dreary stone buildings in Europe, while the winds howl outside and ghosts roam the halls, is because of three subcultures. The first is goth, a genre of music and fashion intersecting with many other mediums. Now, I am no expert in the goth subculture, and I honestly know very little of its history, but I think it's fair to say that for many of us, when we think of goth, we think of dark, black clothing, black eyeliner, and a sort of punk emo music. Then, of course, we have the Gothic horror, with its creaky old haunted mansions, Victorian fashion, and dark, thrilling plots. And finally, we have dark academia, the aesthetic that was impossible to escape back when I regularly used Tumblr in my teenage years. As the name suggests, this once more emphasizes the darkness and gloom of these old European buildings, especially in France and England, where Gothic architecture provides a popular setting. This last one brings to the forefront a specific element that many people now associate with the Gothic style: aging. This may sound silly, of course these centuries-old buildings have aged, but the aesthetic that so many people seem to value is the decay or neglect that these spaces seem to exude. Darkened walls, cobwebs, the idea that a ghost may be lurking just out of sight, the feeling that the dust and soot holds some manner of history in itself, as if the building loses cultural or aesthetic value if it doesn't visually reveal its age. We have become so accustomed to seeing these buildings under layers of fire, smoke, and water damage, modified so intensely by the effects of time that they no longer glitter like they once did, that we are incapable of seeing the Gothic period as anything other than darkness. But if there are two things that truly define French Gothic architecture, they are light and color. The Gothic period, which roughly spans the 11th through 13th centuries, follows the Romanesque period of architecture, defined by barrel vaults and rounded arches, following the examples of classical Roman architecture, hence the name Romanesque. Gothic architecture moves away from this, featuring pointed instead of rounded arches, thinning the columns and elevating for ever more impressive heights. These cathedrals strive to touch the heavens, to the point that they reach the limits of what stone could bear. Every part of this architectural style led the eye upwards. There was an added lightness to these structures, with more space allocated to increasingly large windows, showing off the skill of the architects and workers to sustain such weight on a structure that seemed to get thinner and lighter than its predecessors. It is so unfortunate that this period has become so associated with darkness and gloom, when it saw an increased desire to let light into the cathedrals, allowing a divine light to illuminate the congregation. The artists involved in the construction of the cathedrals heightened the effects of these new and large spaces, of the increased amount of light flowing into the church. It's hard to imagine a Gothic cathedral without stained glass. It has become so ubiquitous with the period. Allowing light to still filter through, the stained glass created mosaics of colored light which still hypnotize visitors today. As the architectural and stained glass technique continued to advance, more and more space could be dedicated to the glass itself, allowing for even more impressive and mesmerizing windows. This was a stunning display of the divine light of God, illuminating a massive holy space in an array of colors that really no secular architecture could rival. Gothic cathedrals were not dark and gloomy spaces. Far from it. They glowed with an incredible illuminated display glimmering through the cathedral as the sun rose and set. So why do we think of this period as being dark and gloomy, beyond the unfortunate influence of early historians and art historians in minimizing the beauty of medieval art in favor of glorifying the Renaissance? One of the culprits is another of the iconic elements of the church space: smoke. Christian churches are often filled with all types of fumes, beyond the centuries of grime contributed by pilgrims, congregations, city pollution, and tourists. Churches have historically been lit by candles, and a cathedral as large and popular as Notre Dame had to be lit by truly impressive numbers of candles. And let us not forget the incense regularly spread throughout the church during Mass. All of the soot, dirt, and wax left by visitors' candles and incense is also accompanied by the damage done by water, time, and, well, fire. While the walls and buttresses of Gothic cathedrals are built with stone, the roofs are not. There are several reasons for this, including the fact that wood is often just cheaper and easier to transport and install than stone. Importantly, wood is also much lighter than stone, allowing for taller and thinner walls that have to sustain less weight than those lifting a fully stone ceiling. Unfortunately, wood has one weakness that stone does not: it burns. And in churches filled with candles, such a large, flammable surface can cause problems. Cathedrals with wood ceilings, wooden pews, canvas and wooden altars and paintings, cloth banners filled with many other flammable objects often burned. The space would be rebuilt and sometimes expanded or modified, and people would cross their fingers and hope another fire would not break out within their lifetimes. This brings us to what work was done in Notre Dame. Most of us are familiar with a Notre Dame that had not been restored in centuries. Walls blackened by soot, paintings darkened by grime. The damage caused by the fire worsened the situation. The entire wood ceiling completely burned and collapsed on the nave below. causing force and fire damage to the interior of the building. The inferno was hot enough to melt metal. Restorers had two main tasks: clean the interior from the fire damage and rebuild the roof and spire. Restorers got to work inside, wiping away centuries worth of soot from the walls alongside the damage caused by the 2019 fire. Here we encounter an issue, and one I find many people are having trouble accepting. I'm not an art restorer, nor do I have insight on what I'm sure were the many conversations had among experts and restorers on how to approach the cleaning in this specific case. But I ask you, how easy would it be to distinguish between soot from 2019 and soot from before? What is the difference between grime caused by aging, which many of us seem to not only tolerate but value, and grime caused by a devastating fire? How do you know what to remove and what to keep? I've seen many people complain that the restoration removed too much, destroying the look of age the building once had. As you may have already seen, the cathedral is now very bright, with the white peristone, also known as Lutanian limestone, fully on display. I've seen some say that the nave was rebuilt, but that is not the case. If you were to take a time machine back to when Notre Dame was first finished, that is the color the stone would have been. I wasn't kidding when I said the French Gothic period was all about light and color. In fact, the Friends of Notre Dame, the non-profit that supports the restoration of the cathedral, says this about the decisions taken on how to approach the project. On July 9, 2020, the National Commission for Heritage and Architecture, CNPA, unanimously approved plans to restore Notre Dame Cathedral to its last complete, coherent, and known state as it stood the morning of the fire. The chief architects of historical monuments presented the restoration plans to the CNPA, which is the advisory council that handles important restoration projects in France. While architects offered proposals to rebuild Notre Dame with a glass spire, rooftop garden, and other modern features, this decision ensures that the cathedral will be rebuilt as we know it, including rebuilding a spire identical to the one designed in the 19th century by architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. Rebuilding efforts will also use original materials, like wood for the roofing. The officials involved in the reconstruction of the cathedral were clearly concerned with preserving it as it was, not erecting a new 21st century building. So what exactly was done in Notre Dame? Cleanup work in preparation for the actual restoration project was extensive, as all damaged scaffolding had to be removed, as well as the debris that had fallen into the nave. New scaffolding then had to be installed, and any fragile or damaged objects also had to be moved to avoid further damage, because remember, the roof was now gone, so the interior was completely exposed to the elements. Cleanup efforts also had to deal with the dangerous lead dust that had dispersed when the roof and spire had burned, which raises the point that restorers and conservators also have to be very careful with the variety of materials they have to handle in their daily work. On the subject of danger, we also need to consider and be thankful for all of those who rushed to the scene of the burning cathedrals in 2019. Firefighters were able to control the fire before it reached the bell towers and caused further damage to the priceless stained glass windows, and the various works of art and Christian relics housed in the building had to be removed, with only some suffering damage. Most importantly, no one was killed, and the firefighters were able to tame a fire raging over 100 feet in the air. Now, after the fire was controlled and the initial cleanup was underway, even more complex efforts had to be undertaken. The grand organ, constructed in 1730, which with 8,000 pipes and standing at 32 feet tall is the largest in France, was entirely dismantled and removed. The fire had started on the roof, and unfortunately the vast majority of it was entirely destroyed, so a completely new roof, still made of wood because remember the project organizers wanted to preserve the cathedral as it was, had to be built and assembled. 1,000 oak trees were felled to create the beams necessary to span the space, beginning a painstaking process of preparing the wood to be placed on the roof. All of the damage from the fire, the smoke, and the water necessary for controlling the spread of the fire then had to be reversed. So if your issue is that you think they rebuilt Notre Dame, you don't have to worry about that. The nave is still the original. The only thing that was entirely built from scratch was the roof because, it burned. If your issue is that the restoration removes the age of the building, the old feel of the space, then we have a totally different conversation. Here we encounter the age-old question of what the role of restoration and conservation is. Do we simply stabilize the monument, or do we reveal its original colors? Personally, I have nothing against returning the work to its original glory. I find that most times our attachment to the damage and effect of aging that darkens stone and dampens colors is a misplaced reliance on a concept of history and the art historical canon established by people who had a very specific agenda. For example, I find it a bit silly that people are upset that Notre Dame has lost its Gothic nature. I think it has finally regained it. The idea that the aging is an inextricable part of a work of art doesn't really convince me. As an art historian, I'm more interested in seeing the work as the artist intended. But again, this is just my opinion. Many art historians sway more towards conservative conservation, preserving those signs of aging as an inextricable part of the work itself. As I mentioned, this debate is basically constantly raging about any and all works of art, from paintings to architecture. Have you ever seen the Mona Lisa? The painting, as it is known today, arguably the most famous and recognizable work of art in the world, is yellowed and dark. If we look at this other portrait made by a student of Leonardo and probably made at the same time as the Mona Lisa, we can see that the colors are much brighter, the details easier to see. It's not that Leonardo painted with yellows and browns, it's because the Mona Lisa is really, really dirty. It has yellowed over time because, while today it is in a closely monitored and climate-controlled environment, safely displayed behind bulletproof glass, this is a relatively recent context. It has been exposed to changing temperatures, moisture, dirt, pollution, and touch, which have caused its varnish to accumulate dirt and eventually yellow. So why don't they clean it, you ask? Surely the Louvre has enough money to clean it. The legal process to remove it from display and take it to a restorer alone would be truly insane, let alone the fact that the Louvre's centerpiece would be off display for a presumably long period, as art conservation takes a lot of time in planning, testing, recording, and very slow, careful work. Beyond the financial effect for the museum with loss of revenue, complaints from visitors, and the cost of the restoration itself, I also don't know which restorer would be comfortable with having the Mona Lisa under their knife, so to speak. But even if we ignore all of these practical issues, why would the Louvre want to so drastically alter the symbol of its museum? The Mona Lisa is kind of everywhere. Even more than the Sistine Chapel ceiling, this work has been photographed and reproduced countless times, found on the surface of basically any item you could imagine. Think of suddenly walking into the Louvre and you get a dramatically different painting than the one that has become so familiar to all of us. The Mona Lisa has become more than a painting. It is an integral part of the brand of the Louvre. I can't imagine they would want to change it anytime soon. But a lack of cleaning doesn't mean the Louvre isn't taking care of the work. This is where the difference between conserving an object so it doesn't deteriorate past its current state and restoring an object to its original state comes into play. Different institutions will have different priorities for different works. As you can see, there are a myriad of factors that come into play when deciding how and why to restore or conserve a work of art. I personally cannot wait to see the restored Notre Dame in person, and I commend everyone who put years of painstaking work into cleaning and renovating this building. I understand why some people are shocked or unhappy by the result, but I urge you to consider that there really isn't one right way to approach this topic. This is one of those fun parts of academic discourse where we can just talk at each other over and over without needing to come to a decision, because both sides have strong arguments for and against, and ultimately the issue will always have to be decided on a case-by-case basis, and there is never going to be a restoration or conservation effort that doesn't have its fervent supporters and critics. Or, as my grandfather always said, people are going to complain whatever you do, so just do whatever you want.